The morning of June 1984 began with unusual movement on the quiet street of Cottage Grove, Oregon. 3 unmarked police cars silently parked in front of an old, weathered wooden house set back at the end of the road. Neighbors slightly pulled back their curtains, watching as officers in PD jackets positioned themselves around the property as if preparing for a sensitive approach. Inside, a young man named Ben Turner was standing in the kitchen, absent-mindedly making himself a cup of coffee, a rare habit that still made him feel normal after years of living reclusively with minimal contact. A loud, decisive knock sounded at exactly Ben Turner, Cottage Grove PD. "We need to verify your identity in connection with a missing person case from..." The officers later recounted that the young man's hands froze on the mug handle, but his eyes retained a strange vacant look, as if he knew the moment had finally come when the past could no longer stay buried. Before we dive deeper into this shocking true story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you love journeys into forgotten quests for long-forgotten justice, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next part. Summer 1968. The Willow Glen neighborhood in San Jose still retained its familiar peaceful rhythm, where every family knew one another, children rode bikes down tree-lined streets, and doors were often left unlocked because people believed nothing bad could happen in such a tight-knit community. The Hall family was no exception. Thomas Hall, an engineer at IBM, and his wife Margaret, a day-shift nurse at Good Samaritan Hospital, had lived there nearly 8 years. Neighbors regarded them as a stable, friendly family that always took good care of each other. Their only son, 10-year-old Benjamin Hall, had a habit of waking early every summer morning, quickly eating the breakfast his mother prepared, then riding his bike a few blocks to the little corner store to buy gum or look at the model airplanes hanging behind the counter, a routine so regular that everyone in the neighborhood was used to the sight. That morning began no differently: clear skies, gentle sunlight, empty streets, and Benjamin left the house in high spirits, promising to be back before noon. But one odd detail appeared right after he left. Henry Dalton, the neighbor 2 houses down, was standing in his front yard, as if waiting for someone. Dalton was generally seen as a quiet man, sometimes a little withdrawn, but polite enough never to leave a bad impression. He was a former serviceman, lived alone, and occasionally chatted with the neighborhood kids, especially when he had a chance to show off old electronics he'd repaired. His presence that early in the morning caught a few adults' attention, but no one thought it was cause for concern until he stepped close to the curb and called Benjamin over. A little neighbor girl, Sophie Miller, standing in her own front yard, saw Benjamin stop and talk to Dalton. She couldn't hear what they said but remembered Dalton pointing toward a navy blue Nova parked nearby, and after a few seconds of hesitation, Benjamin walked toward the car with him. Sophie later said Benjamin looked a little confused but not resistant, as if he thought it was just a small thing that would be over quickly. That was the last time anyone in the neighborhood saw Benjamin in sight. About an hour later, when Margaret returned home during her shift break, she realized Benjamin hadn't come back as usual. At first she assumed he was off playing somewhere, but as time passed and no one had seen him around the neighborhood, worry quickly turned to panic. Thomas immediately left work and rushed home. Together they went door to door asking, then split up to search the routes Benjamin usually took. A few neighbors said they hadn't seen anything unusual, while Sophie timidly recounted seeing Benjamin go with Dalton, information that startled everyone but whose full gravity no one yet grasped. The Halls kept searching for nearly 2 hours, walking adjacent streets, calling his name until their voices were hoarse, but there wasn't the slightest sign Benjamin was still nearby. When despair became palpable and time passed without a single clue, Margaret decided to call the police, reporting that their son had vanished and no one in the neighborhood knew where he was. That was the moment an ordinary worry turned into a true emergency. Immediately after Margaret Hall's frantic call, the San Jose Police Department dispatcher logged it as a missing child under 12. The type of incident always given top priority under the department's rapid response rules of the era. Within minutes, the nearest patrol unit was dispatched to the Hall residence to begin gathering initial information and assessing the situation. 2 on-duty officers arrived while the family was still standing in the yard, exhausted from searching and lacking any leads. They conducted quick interviews to establish the last confirmed sighting of Benjamin, what he was wearing, what if anything he had with him, and whether he'd shown any unusual behavior before leaving. The fact that Benjamin had taken no backpack, toys or personal items led police to lean toward an involuntary disappearance and reinforced the assessment that urgency needed to be escalated. After collecting the family's information, officers began constructing a preliminary timeline. The first critical data points were: Benjamin left the house shortly after 8:11 a.m. Sophie Miller's statement about seeing him beside Dalton in the navy blue Nova, and the time the family realized he hadn't returned, leading to the police call late that morning. Police asked everyone present, neighbors, to recall their own morning movements for time cross-referencing. From this, a temporary timeline took shape. Benjamin leaves home, meets Dalton, is last seen near the Nova, then completely vanishes from neighbors' view. Once the initial timeline was set, the expanded response team at the scene began searching surrounding areas using a standard radius sweep centered on the Hall house. Officers systematically checked large bushes, empty garages, neighboring backyards, storm drains, and concealed spots along Benjamin's usual route. Nothing turned up. No shoes, no scrap of paper, no personal items. Nothing to suggest Benjamin had moved through the area after being seen with Dalton. Concurrently, a K9 unit was brought in to boost detection chances. The tracking dog was given Benjamin's scent from the hall porch, then led searchers along the 2 blocks he typically rode. However, when they reached the intersection with Lincoln Avenue, the larger road leading to Highway 87, and routes out of the area, the scent trail stopped abruptly. This is a common indicator that the victim was transported by vehicle, because once the scent is cut off at that point, the dog can no longer follow due to the vehicle having left. The complete absence of even basic traces in the neighborhood further supported the conclusion that Benjamin was no longer nearby from very early on. Meanwhile, another group of officers began reviewing everyone known to be in the neighborhood that morning. The only name that stood out was Henry Dalton. Multiple neighbors confirmed he had been in his yard and had interacted with Benjamin. Dalton was invited to speak right in his own front yard to keep the conversation natural. When asked about his morning, Dalton said he was outside only 10-15 minutes before going inside to fix an electronic device. However, that didn't match the time Sophie saw Benjamin beside the Nova, nor another neighbor's statement that Dalton had left the yard earlier than that. Furthermore, when asked directly whether he had seen Benjamin, Dalton insisted he only saw the boy from a distance and never spoke to him, directly contradicting Sophie's account that he stood close and pointed at the car. Police noted these inconsistencies in the interview record and paid special attention to Dalton's visible nervousness when the time of the boy's disappearance was mentioned. Although there was still no basis to assign blame or detain him, his file was flagged as one of the persons of highest interest. At the conclusion of the initial day's work, police continued verifying the time periods Dalton provided while cross-checking against the evolving timeline from witnesses and family. While search teams expanded into adjacent side streets, investigators determined it was highly likely Benjamin had left Willow Glen by motor vehicle within a very narrow window after leaving home. With those still fragmented but highly alarming pieces of evidence, the case was immediately elevated from a standard missing person report to a child abduction investigation, marking a crucial shift in how authorities would handle the case going forward. While the search around the Hall residence was still ongoing, the investigation team began expanding to a full canvass of all witnesses in the neighborhood, viewing this as a necessary step to fill the remaining time gaps from the initial phase. Officers divided the block into sections, going door to door to record morning observations, focusing especially on homes with a direct line of sight to the route Benjamin normally took. Many residents said they saw nothing unusual, but several accounts started to intersect. The most significant was that a teal-green-blue car was seen moving slowly along the street near the Hall home that morning. A middle-aged woman explained she noticed the car from her front porch while preparing breakfast. A man on the north corner said he saw the same vehicle parked nearby, though he couldn't recall anyone getting in or out. These descriptions matched Dalton's Nova and suggested his vehicle was present during the window when Benjamin vanished. Among the witnesses, Sophie Miller's account required particular clarification, as she was the only one who saw direct interaction between Benjamin and Dalton. Two officers revisited Sophie at her home to carefully explore her memory without leading or influencing the child. Sophie described standing in her yard and watching Dalton lean down to say something to Benjamin while pointing toward the Nova. The distance was close enough for her to clearly recognize both individuals, but not close enough to hear what was said. When asked about her family's morning routine, Sophie mentioned her mother was preparing to leave for work, a detail that could be verified through the mother's work schedule. This helped police anchor Sophie's statement to a more specific time frame rather than relying solely on a child's subjective sense of time. Accounts from adult witnesses helped bolster the weight of Sophie's statement. They placed the Nova in the area during overlapping time periods, allowing the investigation to reconstruct events sequentially. One man living across from Lincoln Avenue reported hearing the loud engine of a sedan leaving the area toward the main road, a detail that aligned perfectly with where the K9 track had ended. The scattered pieces of information were beginning to form a connected chain, giving police a clearer picture of the vehicle's behavior and departure route from the neighborhood. The investigation team cross-referenced every statement for consistency with known facts and independence between sources. Adult witnesses with fixed morning routines were considered to have low margin of error. Those with clear daily habits, such as the woman who fed her cat or the man who opened his garage, became reliable time markers that clarified the car's movement. Sophie's statement, while rich in observational value, was still scrutinized because children's memories can be affected by time or emotion. Investigators used a repetitive approach, asking the same questions at different times and rephrasing them to test consistency. Sophie's stable descriptions of her vantage point, distance, and the way Dalton pointed at the car were deemed credible, especially since they matched evidence already collected at the scene. Police compiled all statements into a provisional timeline. It began with Benjamin leaving home in a normal state, followed by Dalton's appearance near the curb, confirmed by at least two adult witnesses. Sophie directly witnessed the interaction between Dalton and Benjamin. The teal Nova was present, moving slowly, then departed. At Lincoln Avenue, the scent trail ended, coinciding with a witness hearing an engine. Though exact minutes could not be pinpointed, the sequence was coherent enough to conclude that Dalton was at the critical location at the critical time. A key part of the next analytical phase was evaluating each witness's reliability, determining which statements were primary anchors and which required further verification. Adult witnesses whose recollections were tied to daily routines and unaffected by strong emotion were rated highly stable. Sophie's account was central for the direct sighting, but needed to be corroborated by other evidence to minimize risk of distortion. Less certain witnesses, or those repeating second-hand information, were categorized as reference only. The final synthesis created a fuller timeline of the morning Benjamin disappeared. It revealed three major events in rapid succession: Benjamin leaving home, Dalton approaching him, and the Nova departing the area precisely when Benjamin was no longer seen. Although not yet enough to reach a conclusion or file charges, the witness canvas provided a critical foundation for the next investigative direction and sharply highlighted Dalton's role in the chain of events, requiring deeper verification. The convergence of witness statements and the presence of the Nova elevated Dalton to a person of special interest, prompting the investigation team to shift to an in-depth review of his background and activities during the period of Benjamin's disappearance. Dalton lived alone, had a military record showing prior Navy service before discharge, and afterward worked from home repairing electronic equipment. Neighbors described him as minimally social with adults, but unusually approachable with children, often inviting kids over to see old items or show off devices he was fixing. This pattern of focusing on young children and being unusually comfortable with them was flagged by investigators as inconsistent with the reclusive demeanor he showed toward adults. Police reviewed Dalton's residency history, confirming he had moved to the neighborhood roughly 3 years before the incident and had periods of unclear travel between California and Nevada during his first year there, though no public legal violations were recorded. Verifying these travel periods became significant for assessing whether Dalton had exhibited similar behavioral patterns before or had a tendency to leave areas abruptly. To better understand Dalton's interactions with Benjamin, officers continued canvassing neighbors. Many reported that Dalton often sat in his front yard repairing items and would call children over to chat, sometimes asking them to hold tools or carry things inside. No one had ever seen him act aggressively or threateningly, but all agreed he was friendlier with children than normal, especially with Benjamin, who had been seen several times stopping to talk with him while walking past. The fact that Benjamin showed no fear when Sophie saw him next to Dalton aligned with the assessment that the boy was too familiar with Dalton's presence to sense real danger. Police closely examined Dalton's Chevrolet Nova, the vehicle mentioned by multiple witnesses. It had been registered to him for 2 years and was regularly seen parked in front of his house. No major repairs were recorded near the time of the incident, but routine maintenance records showed Dalton drove frequently, including longer trips of unclear purpose in certain months. This raised questions about whether he habitually left the neighborhood at unusual hours, directly relevant to the theory that he took Benjamin away that same morning. Technological limitations at the time prevented modern forensic traces like fibers, DNA, or particulates. Nevertheless, the Nova remained strongly linked to the disappearance due to matching independent witness observation. When cross-checking the timeline Dalton provided, detectives found multiple discrepancies. Dalton claimed he was only outside briefly before returning indoors to work, yet 2 witnesses placed him outside at the exact time Benjamin left home, while Dalton's version deliberately pushed his presence later. He also insisted he had no direct contact with Benjamin that morning, directly contradicted by Sophie's account. Another neighbor recalled seeing Dalton bend down to talk with Benjamin from a distance. These inconsistencies were enough for investigators to question Dalton's truthfulness. Though not yet prosecutable evidence, they indicated Dalton was attempting to distance himself from the crucial time frame, a common behavior among subjects seeking to avoid implication. The team created a comparison chart of scene data, witness statements, and Dalton's own information, revealing a chain that placed Dalton at the key location with a matching vehicle. A relationship close enough to approach Benjamin without raising alarm, and inconsistent statement. These factors converged to position Dalton as the central suspect, compelling investigators to focus subsequent efforts on proving or disproving his role through deeper examination of his actions. Route and ability to leave the area the morning Benjamin disappeared. As soon as the possible routes for Dalton had just been mapped out, the investigation team began facing a series of false leads and noise from the community, constantly pulling the investigation off its main focus. The rapid spread of news about a missing child led many people to believe they had seen Benjamin in places dozens, even hundreds of miles away from San Jose, forcing police to follow up on every single tip, because they could not risk ignoring any potential clue during this critical early phase. The first case came from Monterey, where someone claimed to have seen a boy matching Benjamin's description at a coastal rest stop. The local team was dispatched to check, but when photos and descriptions were compared, there was no match at all. Shortly after, a call came from Gilroy reporting a boy with a strange man at a shopping mall. The description sent back to San Jose showed that height, hair color, and clothing all failed to match. These 2 leads consumed resources and time, making the police even more aware that they had to balance rapid response with careful filtering of information. In addition to mistaken sightings, the team received numerous anonymous calls spreading baseless claims, such as Benjamin is being held in a warehouse south of the city, or a criminal group has taken him out of state. These tips created significant pressure because investigators had to verify them to avoid missing a real lead, yet they also diluted the focus that had been placed on Dalton. Some calls clearly intended to mislead, including individuals who called repeatedly describing different locations, which police eventually logged as harassment. Handling these calls required sorting them by credibility, cross-checking sources, and determining whether they came from concerned citizens or someone deliberately creating chaos. Amid the leads pulling in every direction, a brief period of wrongly suspecting the family also occurred. A group of officers questioned whether internal conflict or disciplinary issues might have caused Benjamin to run away, despite evidence that he had taken nothing with him. During that era, many child disappearances in the United States turned out to stem from family problems, so exploring this angle was not unusual, even though it wasted additional time to prove that Benjamin's parents were completely uninvolved and had no motive. The verification process included checking Thomas's work schedule, reviewing family interactions based on neighbor statements, and re-examining the entire family's psychological medical history. All data confirmed that the Hall family was stable with no signs of violence or conflict. An important conclusion, but one that cost the investigation nearly 2 more days. At the same time, forensic limitations in 1968 made every attempt to find physical traces extremely difficult. Technology to analyze trace evidence on vehicles barely existed, security cameras were not widespread, GPS did not exist, and records from gas stations or stores relied solely on human memory. Even checking tire tracks on the road was ineffective because streets were constantly used by traffic, erasing marks in a short time. Testing fibers, hair samples or fingerprints outside the Hall residence was also impossible due to the lack of proper comparison standards. From the scene itself, no physical evidence confirmed that Benjamin had passed through any specific point after leaving the neighborhood. Every time the investigation branched into a new direction, it had to return to the starting point because there was no solid data to develop a complete investigative thread. The likelihood that Benjamin had been taken away by car made tracing through physical evidence practically impossible. The team realized the chain of events had unfolded too quickly. Benjamin left home, met Dalton, and disappeared from the neighborhood in a very short window of time. The brevity of that time frame meant evidence barely had time to remain, forcing police to rely almost entirely on witnesses and statements. This created further difficulty because the accuracy of human memory declines rapidly over time, especially when witnesses are affected by anxiety or community rumors. The result of these limitations was that the investigation temporarily stalled. Although Dalton remained the primary suspect, the team still lacked a complete chain of evidence to confront him more aggressively. Leads extending beyond San Jose yielded nothing, and false tips continually scattered resources. In the temporary war room at the police station, the densely annotated timeline still stopped at the moment the Nova left the neighborhood, with no further information to move forward. The lead investigator concluded that more data on Dalton's movements and activities was needed because all current signs pointed to him, but the gaps remained too large for a decisive next step. The investigation within San Jose yielded no new data, forcing the team to take the disappearance beyond local jurisdiction and bring in support from the California Highway Patrol and police departments in neighboring counties. The goal now was to expand the search radius along routes Dalton might have taken, especially the major highways heading east and northeast, where dense traffic allowed a vehicle to blend in within minutes. CHP deployed additional patrols along highways 87, 101, and 280, noting any reports of a green Nova or suspicious behavior by a man matching Dalton's description. Tracking teams were simultaneously sent to narrower roads, back roads, and forest paths heading toward Nevada areas with low population density and many stretches not under regular highway patrol surveillance. These locations received special attention because of their seclusion, allowing a suspect to stop or avoid checkpoints. Search teams had to hike into sections inaccessible by patrol car, checking temporary parking areas, roadside rest spots, and rock alcoves where a vehicle could stop without being visible from the highway. Despite all efforts, nothing related to Benjamin or any sign that Dalton had passed through was found. Meanwhile, one investigative unit followed the angle of checking motel and lodging records across Central and Northern California, focusing on establishments along potential escape routes. Many motel owners recalled a slight summer increase in guests, but had no clear records of license plates or guest descriptions, partly because registration practices at the time were very casual. Some places only kept handwritten names without requiring ID verification, making tracing through records nearly impossible. Still, investigators tried to compare signatures in guest books, hoping to find handwriting or an alias linked to Dalton. The result was no clear matches, though a few cases raised suspicion but lacked evidence to confirm. Another approach was screening lists of registered sex offenders, individuals previously reported for inappropriate behavior with children, or those investigated in nearby child disappearances. Although Dalton was not on any official list, the review was necessary to rule out other suspects and avoid missing a possible second perpetrator. Records were pulled from counties like Santa Clara, Alameda, and Contra Costa, but no listed individual was in the Willow Glen area that morning. A few had lived nearby years earlier but no longer resided in the region. All were cleared. Throughout this period, police departments along major roads were alerted to watch for any boy traveling with a middle-aged man matching Dalton's description. A handful of scattered reports came in but formed no connected pattern, similar to the false leads from the earlier phase. Notably, a report from Reading described an older man in an old car stopping at a gas station with a boy aged about 10-12, but when time, location, and clothing description were checked, the case did not match any of Benjamin's known details. The absence of physical evidence made every piece of information fragile. Investigators constantly had to weigh expanding the search against the risk of being pulled further from the central suspect. When all data from the expanded phase was reviewed, the overall picture remained unchanged. No indication Benjamin was still near the city, no confirmation he was seen at any motel, and no data from neighboring counties to establish a clear route. Every expanded direction ended in a dead end. Screening offenders produced no new suspects, further confirming Dalton as the only person appearing in the chain of events. Despite assistance from multiple law enforcement agencies, the expansion yielded no valuable new lead. Investigators concluded that if Dalton had taken Benjamin, their journey had quickly moved beyond the reach of local forces. The silence along the highways, the lack of witnesses outside the starting area, and the emptiness of summer motel records that year, forced the team to face the reality that they had reached the limit of what was possible at that stage. The statewide search efforts showed that police had hit the limit of data collectible in the initial phase, and with no new traces or witnesses emerging, the investigation gradually slowed despite many unanswered questions still surrounding Dalton. The team continued re-examining every rote, report and statement for many more months, but everything led to the same reality: no new leads to pursue, and all potential directions had been checked to the point where further progress required additional data. 1 year after Benjamin disappeared, law enforcement had to face the decision every investigative agency dreads: halting active investigation and moving the file to temporary storage. Although the case remained flagged as a priority if new information surfaced, active searching and investigation could no longer be sustained because department resources had to shift to other cases with clearer leads. When the case was officially transferred to the San Jose PD Cold Case Unit, all existing documents, witness statements, road analyses, information on Dalton period maps, and the list of checked leads were organized and bound according to unit standards. This marked the moment Benjamin Hall's missing person file became one of dozens of unsolved cases in Santa Clara County, a reality that left the family and community disappointed, even though everyone understood the police had done everything possible in the initial phase. Even after the file officially went cold, Detective Laura Martinez, who had been involved from the first days, maintained a personal interest in Benjamin's case. She frequently reviewed the file, compared small details, and noted points that remained unexplained, such as Dalton's contradictory statements or the exact time the Nova left the area. Martinez believed something in the original data had not been connected properly, even though no new leads existed to develop further. Per Cold Case Unit protocol, the file was reviewed annually, or whenever a related report came in from any state, and Martinez voluntarily took on those reviews, hoping something would stand out from the thick set of documents created during the initial investigation. While police were forced to reduce involvement, the Hall family continued their own efforts. They printed posters, contacted missing children organizations, sent letters to police departments inside and outside California, and posted Benjamin's description on every community bulletin board they could reach. Benjamin's parents regularly contacted local media to keep the case alive, hoping to jog someone's memory about Dalton or his Nova. Some residents with vague memories from other areas sent tips to the family, but none helped close the information gap. Nothing new emerged, no additional witnesses, no one detained in connection with the case. The prolonged silence over months and then years caused the disappearance to fade gradually from community memory, though for the Hall family the pain remained unchanged. Prayer vigils, gatherings calling for information, and brief meetings with police became less frequent as time passed, without change. For the investigative agency, the case entered true cold case stagnation: no new leads, no changes to the file, and no ability to move forward or revisit any step effectively. The original timeline remained with its verified markers, but lacked data to expand. Dalton's possible movements remained unprovable hypotheses. All evidence stood still, as if the moment the Nova left Lincoln Avenue was also the moment the case stopped revealing anything more. In that context, the Benjamin Hall case became one of the typical examples from that era that the investigative system could not push further, leaving behind an open file with no momentum to continue. While the investigation in San Jose gradually stalled, what actually happened to Benjamin on the day he vanished took an entirely different direction, starting the moment Dalton put him in the blue Nova and left the Willow Glen neighborhood. The road out of San Jose did not stay within city limits, as police had hoped. Dalton didn't stop in any nearby areas but headed straight northeast, taking main roads to escape the urban area as quickly as possible. With his travel experience and advanced preparation, shown by the fact that he arrived at exactly the right time and parked in an inconspicuous spot, he easily got Benjamin out of California on the very first day. The journey across the state line into Nevada took place on quiet roads where traffic was light enough that no one would notice a middle-aged man traveling with a young boy. Benjamin initially had no reason to be suspicious. He knew Dalton, and at that point he still believed this was just a short trip or something that would end quickly. Dalton took advantage of that to keep everything calm. He told Benjamin that his parents were in trouble and that he had been asked to take him somewhere safer until things were resolved. Those words not only stopped Benjamin from trying to run away, but also began laying the foundation for the psychological dependence Dalton wanted to create. After crossing Nevada, Dalton continued north with Benjamin to Oregon, the state where he had lived for years before moving to San Jose. Choosing Oregon was not random. There Dalton had several places he had rented long-term in the past, and a few old acquaintances who either wouldn't recognize him anymore or wouldn't pay attention to a strange child with him. Once there, Dalton rented a small cabin on the outskirts, far from any residential area and surrounded by sparse forest, an ideal location to isolate Benjamin from all outside contact. In the early days there, Dalton maintained total control over every activity. He set strict daily schedules, controlled what items Benjamin was allowed to touch, and absolutely prevented him from interacting with anyone nearby. Whenever they went out, Dalton kept Benjamin right by his side, or left him at the cabin with the warning that it wasn't safe without him. Physical isolation quickly turned into psychological isolation as Dalton began building a new narrative around Benjamin's situation. In this story, his family was in danger, the police couldn't be trusted, and if Benjamin tried to leave or told anyone the truth, the consequences would be severe for both him and his parent. Dalton stressed that he was the only one trying to help, turning himself from captor into protector in the eyes of the 10-year-old boy. The repeated misinformation, delivered in a calm but controlling tone, prevented Benjamin from realizing he was completely cut off from the real world. He had no opportunity to receive any other source of information to counter Dalton's story. At the same time, Dalton began restricting the boy's sleep, creating mild but constant psychological pressure. This gradually eroded Benjamin's ability to judge right from wrong in critical situations, and instead of suspicion, he focused on trying not to disappoint Dalton. Every time Benjamin asked about his parents, or wanted to write them a letter, Dalton twisted it to say they were in hiding, and couldn't risk being found. Each small act of manipulation built a psychological wall that left Benjamin feeling he had no choice but to obey Dalton. In that environment, dependence began to form. Benjamin depended on Dalton for food, shelter, information, and any sense of safety. He also learned to read Dalton's moods to avoid being scolded, shifting the relationship from initial trust to a state of psychological dependence, a pattern commonly seen in long-term child abduction. Gradually, Benjamin stopped asking about returning to San Jose, not because he forgot his family, but because of the vague fear Dalton had planted in his mind. For Dalton, this was the phase where he solidified complete control. For Benjamin, it was the moment he was pushed into a new reality from which he had no way to escape or call for help, causing the only traces connecting him to his old life to disappear as quickly as he had left California that first day. Dalton's control over Benjamin continued to tighten as they settled into temporary life in Oregon, and to legitimize the boy's presence in the new community, Dalton began constructing an entirely new identity for his victim. The name Ben Turner was chosen because it was easy to remember, unremarkable, and fit the simple forged documents Dalton could produce using tools he was already familiar with from his electronics repair work. At that time, creating paperwork wasn't overly difficult because verification processes were limited. A partially filled out birth certificate and a few old school records that Dalton altered by hand were enough for the local school system to accept Ben Turner as a transfer student from out of state. Benjamin was enrolled in a small elementary school on the outskirts where records weren't strictly cross-checked, and kids moving in from other states weren't unusual. Dalton told the school the boy was a distant nephew staying with him while his parents dealt with financial problems. His calm demeanor and non-confrontational attitude made the explanation easy to accept, and no one saw any reason to question it. In the new environment, Benjamin, now called Ben, was taught to avoid getting too close to friends, never talk about his old life, and absolutely never mention his real name. Dalton repeated whenever he could that everything was only temporary and that if Ben let anything slip, they would both be in danger. These reminders turned secrecy into a duty Benjamin believed he had to carry, binding him even more tightly to the role Dalton forced on him. The control wasn't limited to school. At home, Dalton regulated everything Ben said and did, dictating that he only give short answers to strangers and always claim he didn't remember much about the past because he had moved around so much. When they went out, Dalton always accompanied Ben or left him at the cabin with clear instructions not to open the door for anyone else. Any early impulse Ben had to tell the truth was blocked by gentle but effective threats that if he spoke up, the police would take him away forever, and his parents would never find him. That threat, combined with the fear Dalton had already instilled, convinced Ben that silence was the only way to keep his family safe. Over time, Dalton began moving them frequently to avoid recognition. Whenever neighbors started getting too friendly, or when he felt they had stayed in one place too long, Dalton relocated from the small cabin to scattered rental houses around Oregon. Each place lasted only a few months, long enough to avoid prolonged attention. The constant moves meant Ben never had a chance to form close relationships with anyone, a tactic that kept him isolated and dependent. Those deliberate moves, however, left behind traces Dalton hadn't anticipated: temporary school enrollment records for Ben, hurried signatures on administrative forms, or rental agreements that didn't match actual move date. These traces were scattered across systems for years, not enough for any agency to connect them to the California disappearance at the time, but they would later become critical pieces of the puzzle. During this period, the Ben Turner identity became the only reality Benjamin could rely on. His real name, real family, and life in San Jose gradually faded from memory, not because he forgot but because every time he tried to remember, the sense of danger Dalton had planted from the beginning overwhelmed the thought. Each new home, each neighbor they only spoke to in passing, each school year that started and ended without anyone asking too many questions, all of it formed layers of normalization over a situation that was anything but normal. For Dalton, the most important thing was ensuring no one could trace the child living with him back to his origins. For Ben, the most important thing became living in a way that didn't make Dalton angry and didn't make their temporary life worse. Within that cycle, dependence was steadily reinforced, while the traces of the San Jose boy named Benjamin Hall faded among the fragmented lives Dalton had orchestrated. Living under the identity Ben Turner stretched on for years and became the only frame of reality Benjamin could cling to as he entered his teenage years. School, the constant moves, and Dalton's tight supervision shaped him into a withdrawn, quiet kid who avoided questions about his past. To everyone around him, he was just a reserved boy living with a grumpy uncle. No one knew that beneath that ordinary surface was a story hidden by years of manipulation. Although Dalton had tried to erase all old memories, growing up caused fragments of childhood to resurface spontaneously in ways Dalton couldn't control. They weren't complete memories, just vague images. A house with pale walls, a big front yard, a mother's laughter he couldn't name, and a familiar feeling whenever someone at school mentioned the San Francisco Giant. At first Ben thought they were just daydreams or imagination, but as he got older he realized those images didn't feel invented, they felt like pieces of a real life. These fragments began to shake the story Dalton had built for years. Dalton had said his parents abandoned him or were in hiding, but Ben started to sense a warmth in those memory flashes that couldn't be faked, completely opposite the cold version Dalton repeated. The contradictions became clearer as Ben grew old enough to think logically. Dalton said they kept moving because of family circumstances, but Ben couldn't remember any family other than Dalton during their years in Oregon. Dalton claimed he was protecting him, yet always got nervous when strangers asked questions. The more Ben observed, the more their lifestyle didn't resemble any family he saw at school. No friends came over, no relatives visited, no contact from anyone outside. That made the question why start to form, even though he still didn't dare think too far. The doubts grew when Ben began comparing himself to classmates, especially when assigned family tree projects, simple for everyone else but impossible for him. Dalton told him to write vague answers and dodge teachers' questions, which made Ben clearly feel something about his past was being hidden. He couldn't ask anyone else because Dalton watched him closely, and no other adults were close enough to trust. The isolation Dalton had created since childhood now acted as a barrier, preventing Ben from verifying anything. Still, the quiet doubts grew stronger, and Ben started noticing small inconsistencies in Dalton's stories. One time Dalton said his parents had left the state. Another time they were hiding nearby. When asked where he was born, Dalton gave two different answers within a year. Even the name of the elementary school Dalton claimed Ben had attended before Oregon didn't match any real school. When Ben checked a library map, those details weren't enough for Ben to grasp the full truth, but they were enough to show him Dalton's story had holes he couldn't keep patching forever. Despite the growing suspicion, Ben still couldn't confirm his real identity on his own. No documents, no relatives, no reference points, and no one in his social circle treated him like a missing person. To the outside world he was just Ben Turner, a teenager living with his uncle. An ordinary story few would ever think hid something dark. The lack of any anchor meant Ben couldn't be sure the scattered memories were real, or just a teenage psychological reaction. Yet those fragmented memories persisted like seeds of a larger truth, and refused to disappear the way Dalton wanted. Every time he heard a bike bell ringing past, he'd get a fleeting image of riding a little bike in some neighborhood. Every time he saw a kid call out "Mom," a familiar feeling rose up. Those broken memories weren't enough to break Dalton's control, but they were enough to keep alive in his mind the sense that his current life wasn't the whole story. They became quiet clues even though Benjamin himself didn't realize it yet, and formed the foundation that would later connect him to the truth Dalton had hidden for so many years. The lingering doubts in Benjamin's mind had never been strong enough to break him free from Dalton's control, but the sudden change came from a direction he could never have predicted. In 1984, Dalton died abruptly of a heart attack while working alone in the garage behind the house. Death came so quickly that Benjamin, then about 16 years old, didn't even have time to process what was happening beyond the fact that the only person who had controlled every aspect of his life for more than a decade had suddenly vanished from that position of power. In the first hours after finding Dalton motionless on the garage floor, Benjamin slipped into a state somewhere between panic and confusion. He didn't know who to call, didn't know what procedures to follow, and most importantly, didn't know who he was on any official paperwork. Throughout all the years living in Oregon, Dalton had never allowed him access to any official documents or contact with government agencies. That meant when Dalton died, Benjamin didn't just lose his guardian, he also lost the shield, however controlling that shield had been, that had allowed him to exist under a false identity. When the local police were called to handle Dalton's death, Benjamin was forced to give his name, Ben Turner. That was the only thing he could say because it was the identity he had lived under for nearly his entire life. No one questioned it at first, but when the authorities asked for identification to complete the paperwork, Benjamin couldn't produce anything. No birth certificate, no social security card, no valid school records beyond the cursory enrollment forms Dalton had once submitted. This immediately placed Benjamin in a unique legal predicament. A teenager with no clear legal history, no documents proving identity, and no legal guardian. Once it was confirmed Dalton was deceased, the medical examiner and police had to shift focus to Benjamin's situation. Investigators tried to ask about family or relatives, but all he could offer were fragmented memories of the disjointed life Dalton had constructed over the years. He couldn't provide a birthplace, didn't remember a hospital name, had no relatives to contact, and wasn't even sure which state he was born in. The only thing Benjamin could say with certainty was that he had lived with Dalton for as long as he could remember, and even that starting point had grown impossible to pin down. With no way to verify his story, the Cottage Grove Police Department had to treat him as an unidentified individual, a named John Doe, a rare but not unprecedented legal case. They took him to the station to collect basic information and create a temporary file for an adult without valid documentation. In that file, Ben Turner was recorded as the declared name, but it was not considered a legally accurate identity. The department ran searches through the National Missing Persons System, but since Benjamin had disappeared in 1968, an era without today's centralized databases, no immediate matches came back. His original missing person report had been filed by San Jose PD, but in 1984, state and federal databases were not fully interconnected, making an instant link impossible at that moment. There was also no reason for Cottage Grove PD to suspect he might be the victim of a 16-year-old abduction from another state, especially since Benjamin himself could not provide any specific details about his life before Oregon. The only thing clearly noted was his visible bewilderment at suddenly facing the outside world, for the first time without Dalton standing behind him, pulling every string. Nearby police departments were notified, but no one was looking for a teenager named Ben Turner. Tracing him through school records proved difficult because the documents Dalton submitted were often incomplete or manually altered, resulting in inconsistent birth years and birthplaces. Not a single trace directly connected Ben Turner to Benjamin. Dalton's death freed Benjamin from the control that had defined his entire childhood, yet at the same time thrust him into a legal and identity void so vast he could not resolve it alone. Though physically free for the first time in years, he remained trapped between a false identity that had become deeply ingrained and a real past he lacked enough information to read. Cottage Grove PD filed the case, recording him as an individual in need of assistance, but unable to classify him as a recovered missing person because no data matched. From the system's perspective, Ben Turner was simply a young man with no papers, no history, and no clear origin. From Benjamin's perspective, it was the moment he stood between two worlds yet belonged fully to neither. The Ben Turner file sat at Cottage Grove PD as a case with no clear background, and although support units tried to locate data to verify his identity, those efforts gradually faded due to lack of connecting leads. Still, the ambiguity of the file continued to interest a few Oregon officers, especially Officer Raymond Collins, who made a habit of reviewing undocumented cases whenever the state updated its historical missing persons data. Collins had handled many cases where identity was obscured by family circumstances or migration events, but Ben Turner was unusual in that there was literally no reference point, no birthplace, no relatives, no documents, no clear timeline before he appeared with Dalton. When Oregon received an updated list of missing persons from decades earlier, part of a federal effort to consolidate records, Collins scrolled through children reported missing from the late 19th. Among the faded faces in old photographs, one image made him pause. Benjamin Hall, disappeared in 19. The photo supplied by the family showed a boy with light brown hair, an innocent face with faint freckles, common features, yet something distinctive about the eyes and bridge of the nose. Collins felt an inexplicable familiarity as if he had recently seen that face somewhere else. When he pulled up the Ben Turner file again, the feeling sharpened. Though Ben was now a 16-year-old whose face had matured, there were striking similarities: bone structure, eye shape, and especially a slightly crooked smile that tilted to the right, an identical small detail to the 19. Collins knew such matches could be coincidence. Missing children from decades earlier were often sought using vague memories or low-quality photos, but the fact that Ben Turner had zero history and could not provide any information before roughly age 10 gave this coincidence far more weight than usual. After years on the job, Collins understood that the hardest part was sometimes noticing the tiny clues that seemed unimportant. He decided not to ignore the hunch and wrote an internal report to his superiors, suggesting Ben Turner might be a long-term missing person. A printout of Benjamin Hall's old photo was attached alongside a current photo of Ben, and Collins requested direct contact with San Jose Police Department for verification. When the information reached San Jose PD, the cold case unit initially treated it as routine. However, the name Hall and the year 1968 immediately rang a bell for Detective Martinez, who had worked the case for years before it went cold. She pulled the dusty file from the shelf, Sophie's statement, the Nova's road analysis, inconsistencies in Dalton's account. But when she placed the photo of Ben Turner next to the picture of 10-year-old Benjamin, she saw the resemblance went beyond looks. It matched the context. A young man with no legal history, and Benjamin had vanished in circumstances involving Dalton. A man with a record of later moving to Oregon. These factors made it impossible for Martinez to dismiss as mere coincidence. San Jose PD's receipt of the Oregon report triggered a deeper review. The team reopened the entire 1968 file, cross-referencing new information to determine whether Dalton had the time, means, and motive to take Benjamin to Oregon. Old residency records showed addresses Dalton lived at during periods close to Benjamin's disappearance. Though not conclusive proof, the data formed a travel pattern consistent with the original 19. Re-examining the missing person case produced a hypothesis that connected events across more than 16 years. If Ben Turner really was Benjamin Hall, then he had lived under an identity fabricated by Dalton that entire time. Although the theory still had gaps and could not be confirmed immediately, the investigators recognized this was the first time in years they had a concrete link between a living person and the. From one Oregon officer's sudden hunch, a major question took shape. Could Ben Turner actually be the boy San Jose had been unable to find for over a decade? The identity match suspicion did not merely reopen the file. It forced San Jose PD to approach the case from an entirely new angle, starting with comparing, identifying characteristics between Ben Turner and the boy Benjamin Hall from 19. The similarities were not limited to general facial features. Small details such as faint freckles on the left cheek, slightly drooping ears, and a habit of tilting the head gently to the right when confused, all documented in old records, were still present in the current. Although appearance changes over time, fixed elements like facial bone structure and eye shape convinced the team the likelihood of a match was significant. Physical markers were only the beginning. The far more critical step was mapping Dalton's movements from 1968 to 1984 to confirm he could have taken Benjamin out of California and lived with him in Oregon during the entire period Benjamin was missing. Old records showed Dalton had lived in San Jose for 3 years prior to 1968 and had made multiple unexplained trips to Nevada, Oregon, and Idaho. When investigators traced property records, rental agreements, and residency documents, they discovered Dalton had been present in several small Oregon towns, exactly during 1969-1975, the same years Ben Turner first appeared in local school systems. That timing was too precise to ignore. Though records from that era were incomplete, scattered receipts for electronics repairs or cabin rentals provided enough data to tie Dalton to the same areas where Ben had lived, forming a geographic chain that matched the investigative team's original. When plotted against the disappearance timeline, suspicious gaps in Dalton's movements became evident. Days he claimed to have been in San Jose during summer 1968 did not align with neighbor confirmations, and the moment he permanently left the neighborhood coincided precisely with the Nova vanishing from Lincoln Avenue. The period from mid-1968 to early 1969, when no one knew Dalton's whereabouts, overlapped perfectly with Ben Turner's first appearance in Oregon. Investigators realized that overlaying Dalton's known locations onto a master map produced an almost perfect route from San Jose through Nevada and up to Oregon, matching their initial theory, only now they had connecting data that didn't exist in. Re-examining 1968 witness statements, details once considered minor gained new weight. The neighbor on Lincoln who saw a green car speed away, Sophie's description of Dalton signaling Benjamin, the woman who reported the Nova leaving Dalton's house earlier than usual during the week of the disappearance, all supported the conclusion that Dalton fled the area quickly after getting Benjamin into the car. At the same time, contradictions in Dalton's original statement, previously just suspicions, now served as reliable circumstantial evidence that he had deliberately concealed his actions. When every timestamp was connected, the investigators obtained a seamless chain of events. Benjamin disappeared on a 1968 morning. Witnesses saw him beside Dalton. The Nova vanished from the street. Dalton stopped appearing in San Jose. His residency records soon surfaced in Oregon, and starting around. Ben Turner was enrolled in schools corresponding to Dalton's location. This sequence not only filled the case's long-standing gaps, but confirmed a continuous link between Dalton and the victim throughout the post-abduction period, something San Jose PD had never previously been able to prove. When all geographic and chronological markers were combined, the suspicion against Dalton was no longer a theory. It had become the only logical structure that fit every piece of collected evidence. There was no second suspect in the file. No other individual appeared in any state. There was no evidence Benjamin ever left the area with anyone besides Dalton. The complete absence of alternative possibilities made Dalton the sole remaining suspect, not just because he was the last person seen near Benjamin, but because every piece of data over 16 years pointed back to the path he had engineered to remove Benjamin from his former life. By fully cross-checking the timeline from 1968 to 1984, the investigators realized they finally possessed a chain of connections strong enough to seriously consider that Ben Turner was in fact Benjamin Hall, the victim both police and the Hall family had searched for across decades. When the timelines and locations showed significant overlap between Dalton's travels and the appearances of Ben Turner, the investigation team shifted focus to the harder task: finding any surviving physical evidence or legal documents after more than 16 years to strengthen the chain of reasoning. Although forensic capabilities in the 1960s were limited and many records had been lost, the investigators hoped that some indirect traces still existed somewhere in administrative systems or local business files. The first clue came from what seemed like a minor detail. While reviewing Dalton's activities in 1968, an investigator discovered his name on a customer list for repairs at a small garage near LA, Nevada. The garage's location matched the presumed route Dalton might have taken when leaving California immediately after the kidnapping. Although the business had changed hands multiple times, a portion of the old records from that year remained, and there the investigator found an invoice made out to H. Dalton for repairs to the cooling system of a Chevrolet Nova. This matched perfectly with the known fact that Dalton drove a blue Nova, and the invoice was dated only a few days after Benjamin disappeared. Forensic examination of the vehicle itself was no longer possible since the car no longer existed, but the garage invoice became a valuable piece of evidence because it proved Dalton was on the escape route out of California at the exact suspected time. Next, the team turned to handwriting analysis. Although modern forensic technology offered far more support than was available in 1968, the examination still depended on whatever documents they could gather. Dalton's signature appeared on rental agreements, cabin registration logs, and a few purchase receipts from the night. When these signatures were compared to the handwriting Dalton had filled out on Ben Turner's school enrollment forms, the examiner confirmed a very high degree of similarity, indicating that Dalton himself had completed those documents. This was almost certain because Ben had been too young to fill them out himself, and Dalton always controlled the information. Handwriting analysis did not directly prove the kidnapping, but it confirmed that Dalton was behind the paperwork used to conceal the victim's true identity, further reinforcing the pattern of creating a false life for Benjamin in Oregon. A crucial part of reconstructing the timeline was mapping Dalton's residential addresses year by year. Using rental records, temporary contracts, and tax information, the team created a migration map of his movements from. The map showed Dalton constantly moving from one small town to another, typically staying in each place for only a few months to a year. What stood out was that every time he changed addresses, Ben Turner's school records changed as well, following an identical trajectory that could not be coincident. In every area where Dalton had lived, the team obtained school records confirming that Ben had been enrolled at exactly the same time Dalton arrived. In some cases, these records even contained teachers' notes describing Ben as very reserved, rarely talked about his family, or seemed unclear about where he was born. These comments aligned with the psychological state of a child separated from his real family and living under an imposed identity. Investigators regarded them as important indirect indicators of long-term control. At the same time, the scattered medical records from the times Dalton took Ben for treatment during his teenage years were also reviewed. A small clinic in Bend, Oregon still had records of a patient named Ben Turner, who came in for a minor injury at around age 4. In the file, the doctor noted that the accompanying adult, confirmed to be Dalton, answered almost every question about medical history on Ben's behalf. Although not legal proof, it clearly illustrated the pattern of Dalton controlling all information and never allowing Ben to speak for himself about his own background. When all these fragmentary documents were pieced together, a clear trail emerged. Dalton left California immediately after this appearance. He appeared in Nevada at the exact time of travel. Ben Turner surfaced in Oregon during the periods Dalton lived there. School paperwork and medical files all bore signs of Dalton's control, and Ben's entire 16-year journey matched Dalton's movements perfectly. This trail reflected a clear behavioral pattern typical of long-term kidnappings, completely isolating the victim from their previous community, creating a false identity, controlling personal information, restricting social relationships, and constantly moving to avoid detection. These are classic elements in multi-year abductions, and in this case every piece of data pointed to a single perpetrator. Finding evidence that had survived more than a decade not only solidified the hypothesis, but also created the critical foundation to move the case to a higher level of verification, to determine whether Ben Turner was indeed Benjamin Hall. The chain of documentary traces and circumstantial evidence had convinced the investigation team that they were very close to confirming the true identity of Ben Turner. But to prove it conclusively, they needed the most powerful tool modern forensics could offer: DNA analysis. As part of the new NCMEC, National Center for Missing and Exploited Children review process for long-term missing person cases, the Hall family, despite almost 2 decades with no further news, had kept Benjamin's file active in the system. When they were told that an individual possibly connected to the disappearance was under review, they immediately agreed to provide DNA samples from both parents and the closest relatives for comparison purposes. The Hall family DNA samples were sent to a federal laboratory to create a comprehensive reference profile for matching against any data from the suspected individual. Meanwhile, in Oregon, Benjamin, now an adult still living under the name Ben Turner, was encouraged to take a genealogical DNA test to help establish his origin. This was driven not only by the desire to verify identity, but also by legal necessity. To obtain any valid official documents, he needed either a DNA record or proof of existence before reaching adulthood. Benjamin agreed to the test, though he was filled with conflicting emotions and anxiety. Throughout his teenage years, he had often wondered where he really belonged, yet he had never dared face the possibility that his entire life was a facade built by Dalton. Taking the DNA test felt like the first step towards staring the truth in the face, no matter how much that truth might destroy everything he thought he knew about himself. When Benjamin's DNA profile was uploaded to the genealogy database, results did not appear instantly, but within a few weeks, analysts detected significant genetic matches with a Hall family cluster in California. These connections were not distant cousin-level matches, but fell within the close-range category, results that typically only appear when the tested individual has a direct or very close blood relationship with the reference family. As soon as the data reached the notable match threshold, the system automatically notified San Jose PD and NCMEC, flagging the case as a possible identification with high probability. Genetic experts then began detailed segment-by-segment analysis to determine the exact degree of relatedness. Preliminary results showed that Benjamin and the Hall parents shared DNA percentages within the parent-child range, a statistic that is virtually impossible unless they are directly related by blood. This was the breakthrough the team had waited years for. However, genealogical testing only provides probability, not legal certainty. For an official conclusion, a direct forensic DNA test between Benjamin and the Hall parents under strict chain of custody protocols was required. This was arranged under specially controlled conditions to eliminate any chance of error or contamination. All 3 samples were recollected, sealed, and sent to the federal lab. While awaiting results, San Jose PD prepared a complete case summary covering everything from the moment Benjamin vanished, the stalled initial search, the traces left by Dalton, and the emergence of Ben Turner in Oregon's system. Every piece of evidence was compiled so that once the DNA results were confirmed, the case could move forward seamlessly and logically. The DNA results came back faster than expected. Benjamin's sample matched the Hall parents' samples with 99.98% certainty, the near absolute threshold in forensic science. Biologically, Ben Turner was Benjamin Hall, the 10-year-old boy who disappeared from San Jose in 19. Any remaining doubt vanished instantly. The official conclusion was issued: Ben Turner and Benjamin Hall were the same person. With this DNA result, the entire 16-year chain of events was no longer based solely on logical analysis or reasonable inference. It became an indisputable fact, backed by the strongest legal evidence available. From a teenager with no documents, no origins, and incomplete memories, Benjamin was now confirmed as the surviving victim of a rare long-term kidnapping. That truth not only illuminated Benjamin's journey, but also marked a dramatic turning point for a case San Jose PD had once believed would remain forever buried in the cold case archive. The DNA confirmation that Ben Turner was Benjamin Hall became the final piece that completed the picture the investigation team had painstakingly assembled from scattered clues spanning decades. With legal identity now clear, San Jose PD compiled all evidence into a final case closure report that not only confirmed the victim's identity but reconstructed the entire sequence of events, leading to the 1968 disappearance. The chain of evidence was presented chronologically: initial witness statements placing Benjamin with Dalton on the morning he vanished, analysis of the escape route showing the Nova left Willow Glen within minutes, the Nevada garage invoice matching the suspected travel route, Dalton's Oregon residency records aligning perfectly with Ben Turner's appearance in school systems, school and medical notes demonstrating Dalton's total control over Ben's personal information, and finally the DNA results proving direct blood relation between Benjamin and the Hall parent. When laid side by side, this body of evidence formed a seamless, logical narrative that left no room for any suspect other than Dalton. After reviewing the chain, the Santa Clara County District Attorney's Office agreed with the investigators' conclusion that Dalton was the person who kidnapped Benjamin. Dalton's death in 1984 made prosecution impossible, but identifying the perpetrator still carried significant legal and historical weight because it closed one of the department's longest-running and most complex cases. In its official statement, San Jose PD announced that the disappearance of Benjamin Hall, one of the unit's oldest unsolved files, had been solved after more than 16 years through a combination of original scene analysis, expanded federal investigation, historical record review, and especially advances in DNA technology. The announcement was not only a milestone for the agency, but also proof that cases once thought unsolvable can still find answers when technology and data finally align. The case file status was updated from missing cold case to solved, victim located, a line that many had believed would never change. Internally at San Jose PD, Benjamin Hall's name was moved from the missing persons list to the category of victims located alive, with detailed notes about his journey and the extraordinary circumstances of his identity verification. After all legal procedures were completed and the conclusion made public, the next step was to inform the Hall family, people who had lived almost 2 decades suspended between hope and despair. The investigation team, led by Detective Martinez, contacted Benjamin's parents directly to arrange a private meeting before the news went to the media. When told their son was alive, they could not immediately believe it. After so many years of disappointment, they had come to view any hope as illusion. But once they were shown the DNA evidence and the matching process, they understood this time was different. The news was delivered carefully, step by step, giving them time to process the reality that Benjamin, the son they thought was lost forever, had been alive all those years under another name, living a life they could never have imagined. The notification meeting ended in silence, mixed with overwhelming emotion. No further explanation was needed, because the truth itself was powerful enough to fill the enormous void left by years of waiting. With the case officially solved, the focus shifted from the question "Where is Benjamin?" to "How will Benjamin return to the life he lost?" Opening a new chapter no longer centered on investigation, but on the journey of reconnecting everything that had been taken from him over those 6 years. When the case was officially declared successfully resolved, and Benjamin's identity was legally confirmed, the next step in the process was no longer about investigation, but shifted to a deeply humanistic task: reuniting the victim with his family after 16 years apart. The first meeting was arranged with extreme caution, in the presence of psychologists, NCMEC representatives, and investigator Martinez, to ensure neither side, the family nor Benjamin, would be emotionally overwhelmed at that critical moment. The reunion took place in a private support room at Oregon DHS, a space shielded from media and outsiders. When Benjamin's parents entered the room, they no longer saw the timid 10-year-old boy with the smile from their final memory, but a 16-year-old young man taller than his father, his face a blend of familiar old features and changes carved by time. That moment did not unfold like the tearful, dramatic reunions seen on television. There were no immediate sobs, no rushed or overpowering embraces. Instead, there was a long silence, only the eyes of people who had lost so much time trying to recognize each other through new form. Benjamin stood facing them, wanting to step forward yet unsure how to react. He knew they were his parents. The DNA test had proven it, but inside him remained only faint memories of a childhood abruptly severed. His mother was the first to break the silence, not with words, but by slowly walking over and gently placing her hand on Benjamin's cheek, as if afraid he would vanish if she moved too quickly. In that instant, Benjamin couldn't hold back his trembling. For the first time in over a decade, he felt a truly familial touch, not the control he had known during his years with Dalton. His father stood behind, eyes filled with both choked emotion and pride, not only for recovering his son, but because that son had survived circumstances they could never have imagined. After the initial meeting, reintegration proceeded step by step. Psychologists explained to the family that Benjamin had lived for years under manipulation, isolation, and a completely different reality, so they could not expect him to instantly resume the role of the son from before. He needed not only to relearn his family, but to rediscover himself, a life Dalton had distorted at its very foundation. The reintegration phase was supported by victim assistance programs, including scheduled meetings between Benjamin and his family supervised by specialists to prevent unrealistic expectations from either side. The Hall family was guided to listen before asking questions, not to pressure Benjamin into recalling things he wasn't ready for, and especially to accept that some lost memories might never return. For Benjamin, he faced the dilemma of a young man who had a family yet felt like a stranger to them. He wanted connection, wanted to feel he belonged, but years of self-protective habits formed under Dalton's control made it hard to open up immediately. Early sessions focused on small topics: favorite foods, sports he once played, childhood memories his parents gently prompted with photos and stories. Some fragmented memories unexpectedly resurfaced when he saw an old picture of himself on a little bicycle. Others returned only as feelings rather than images. The Hall family remained patient, accepting that recovery could not be rushed. As trust gradually rebuilt, Benjamin began allowing himself to share about his years of isolation. He spoke of the forest cabin, the moves, and the constant fear Dalton had instilled when looking at street. These were not easy conversations, but they were necessary for him to separate himself from the narrative Dalton had constructed for years. During this time, both family and Benjamin had to adjust their expectations of each other. His parents understood the son they reunited with was not the same boy, and they could not fill 16 lost years with a few months or conversations. Benjamin learned to accept care he had long been denied, though the sense of familiarity was still new. He felt their sincerity and effort. The relationship, though it could never fully return to 1968, began to be rebuilt through patience and understanding. Reunion was not a single moment, but an ongoing process, and with every step, Benjamin and the Hall family learned to reconnect the pieces of lives broken for 16 years. Family reunification gave Benjamin a new foundation to move forward, but the psychological damage accumulated over 16 years did not simply vanish because the truth had come to light. Experts began assessing his condition, noting typical symptoms of long-term isolation and control: difficulty trusting adults, stress reactions to sounds that triggered old memories, habitually scanning rooms for exits, and vague guilt despite having done nothing wrong. These psychological scars were not superficial wounds, but behavioral structures formed over years, requiring slow, ongoing therapy. One of the first challenges was Benjamin accepting that most of his life had been controlled and shaped by Dalton. Though Dalton was the abductor, Benjamin had depended on him as a guardian, resulting in conflicting emotions, fear, anger, and a familiarity that complicated detaching from the past. Experts describe this as a distorted attachment bond commonly seen in long-term control victims. To be legally recognized as Benjamin Hall, he underwent lengthy paperwork procedures. The identity Ben Turner, which had no legal basis, was erased from state records, while valid documents for Benjamin Hall were restored per San Jose PD file. He had to reapply for a birth certificate, social security number, and school records, and update all personal information to reintegrate as a normal young adult. Though crucial, this process was emotionally difficult, forcing him to confront that nearly his entire life had been lived under a name that was never his. The Hall family, overjoyed at recovering their son, still had to process the shock of learning he had lived under control and isolation for years. They not only had to learn how to support him, but also adjust their self-perception, how to avoid self-blame for the lost years, and not unintentionally pressure Benjamin with overly idealized reunion expectations. Family counseling sessions were key, helping them understand that rebuilding the relationship had to start from present reality, not from what they had imagined about the child missing since. The San Jose community, upon learning Benjamin was found alive, reacted with astonishment, sympathy, and some lingering regret that many had believed the case would never be solved. Neighbors from that era reached out with encouragement, while newer residents curiously researched the story. This attention partly motivated the family but pressured Benjamin, already exhausted from simultaneously adapting to a new identity in life. Media quickly became a challenge. Once the case was publicized, outlets relentlessly covered Benjamin's rare story, a boy missing for 16 years, found living in plain sight. Any unusual case draws intense public interest, but for Benjamin that attention could easily become burdensome. Experts and authorities worked closely to limit media exposure, protecting him from sensitive questions or reporting that might re-traumatize him. Meanwhile, social reintegration became a long-term challenge. He had to learn to live as a young person with a family, legal identity and clear future, things ordinary to most teens, but utterly foreign to someone who had lived in tightly controlled world. Returning to school, making new friends, and engaging with the community all progressed in small steps. Initially Benjamin withdrew in crowded settings, unaccustomed to attention or well-meaning but disorienting questions. Over time, with family and professional support, he gradually built confidence and reclaimed control over his life, something he had never been allowed under Dalton's domination. That slow journey of recovery marked a vital shift from missing victim to an individual learning to rebuild his life and shape his own future. As Benjamin's reintegration continued, San Jose PD simultaneously finalized a behavioral analysis of Henry Dalton to comprehensively close the case file. Investigators specializing in criminology examined Dalton using criteria typical of long-term child abductions. His profile revealed a classic pattern: approaching the victim within a familiar community, building initial trust, using a friendly environment to lower defenses, then rapidly isolating the victim with careful preparation. Dalton avoided direct violence in the early stage, instead employing psychological manipulation, a method common among offenders who create dependent relationships. Behavioral analysis showed persistence, meticulousness, and strong observational skills that allowed him to identify Benjamin as an approachable, low-guard child already accustomed to his presence. These factors made the victim easier to control. Additionally, Dalton's ability to sustain years of psychological manipulation indicated social detachment and skill at evading detection through repeated relocations, a trait characteristic of lone offenders. The team also investigated whether Dalton was linked to other disappearances from the same era. Cases from California and Oregon in the late 1960s and early 1970s, especially near routes Dalton traveled, were cross-referenced. However, no case provided clear evidence of connection. While some similarities existed, victim-age suburban settings, the absence of direct evidence, witnesses' documents, or precise timelines prevented linking additional cases. All suspicions were noted as reference hypotheses, but lacked legal weight to expand the investigation. Regarding motive and behavioral pattern, Dalton left no personal writings explaining why he abducted Benjamin. Investigators relied solely on behavioral analysis for assessment. The prolonged control and isolation pattern suggested a need to maintain absolute power in a relationship, a complex psychological motive, often seen in offenders who wish to create a reality centered on themselves. Dalton sought no financial gain, never demanded ransom, and never contacted the family, indicating the abduction was not material, but rooted in manipulation and control need. Although many questions remain unanswered, why he specifically chose Benjamin, or how he prepared in the days before the abduction, all collected evidence consistently pointed to one conclusion: Dalton was the sole perpetrator matching the entire chain of events. No other individual appeared in the file. No information suggested accomplices, and no data contradicted the likelihood he acted alone. His behavioral profile, combined with DNA evidence, residency records, circumstantial evidence from Nevada and Oregon, and initial witness statements, formed a solid legal structure affirming Henry Dalton as the sole abductor of Benjamin Hall. The resolution of the Benjamin Hall case, after more than 16 years missing, does not merely close a long pending file. It also provides many crucial lessons for the future investigation of missing child cases. The first and most prominent factor is the role of DNA technology. In the 1960s, police had no way to rely on genetic testing to link a victim to their family, but once the technology advanced, a single DNA sample from Benjamin and his parents was enough to tear down the information wall that had stood for decades. DNA did not just confirm identity, it eliminated all doubt and delivered the definitive answer that traditional investigative methods could hardly achieve. This case has become a classic example of how many cold cases can be successfully reopened when DNA is used as the key tool. Additionally, the case underscores the importance of complete and systematic record keeping. Seemingly minor documents, a short witness statement, a contradictory detail in the 1968 report, a list of past addresses, all became critical links when cross-referenced with data years later. Had the original reports not been preserved, had Benjamin's portrait photos disappeared from the system, or had Dalton's file been lost, the comparison between Ben Turner and Benjamin Hall might never have happened. It was precisely this thorough preservation that allowed investigators to connect fragments scattered across generations of records. Another vital lesson lies in interagency coordination between federal and state authorities. The case was only unraveled because Cottage Grove PD, NCMEC, Oregon DHS and San Jose PD shared information across state lines. That linkage, which was not standardized in the 1960s and 70s, proved decisive in connecting the 1968 missing person report to the 1980. The case clearly shows that abducted children can be taken very far away, and resolution requires cooperation far beyond a single local jurisdiction. Not only modern tools but also efficient information sharing processes played a pivotal role in cracking the case. Another noteworthy point is the value of child witnesses in long-term investigation. Sophie Miller's statement, given when she was only a 9-year-old child, once seemed too vague to serve as strong evidence, yet when placed within the full chain of events, it became crucial in identifying Dalton as the suspect. The details Sophie remembered, how Dalton signaled, how Benjamin stood next to the Nova, formed the initial foundation on which investigators built their hypothesis. The case confirms that children's statements, when properly recorded and carefully preserved, can become vital pieces in solving cold cases many years later. The greatest impact of this case on modern missing children protocols lies in re-establishing the principles of rapid response and expanded search scope. Benjamin's case showed that an abductor can remove a child from the area in a very short time, and the only way to counter that is through rapid alert procedures, immediate data collection, and mobilizing federal support as early as possible. Thanks to lessons drawn from cases like this one, the Amber Alert system and centralized missing children databases were created and strengthened, significantly reducing the golden hours that abductors can exploit. The Benjamin Hall case serves as both proof of the power of modern investigative technology and a reminder that every detail, no matter how small, can make the difference in the journey to deliver justice to victims and their family. The journey of the Benjamin Hall case stretches from the morning he vanished in San Jose in 1968 to the moment he was confirmed alive after 6, reflecting a complex investigative process that stalled at many stages but was ultimately solved through the combination of modern technology and the unrelenting efforts of those who believed the case was never truly closed. In summary, the incident began with a mysterious disappearance, followed by an urgent but fruitless search that caused the file to become a cold case after 1 year. Every initial lead, from witness statements to suspicions about Dalton, was insufficient to support prosecution or deeper investigation. The case seemed destined to remain forever archived until a clue emerged in Oregon in 1984, when an unidentified individual, using the name Ben Turner, was documented. From that point, the case entered a reopening phase, as investigators recognized the striking similarities between Ben's identity and the old missing person file. Key turning points included cross-referencing Dalton's travel timeline, discovering the Nevada garage receipt, analyzing Ben Turner's residence and school records, and a series of circumstantial evidence revealing the deep connection between Dalton and the victim. The climax came with a DNA test, the factor that turned suspicion into undeniable fact and officially moved the case from unsolved to resolved. The deepest impact, of course, was on the Hall family. They endured nearly 2 decades of agonizing loss, then suddenly regained their son after hope had faded. That journey was not just the return of a child, but the revival of a part of the family they thought was gone forever. However, reunion was not a peaceful ending. It began a long healing process for both sides, because 16 years cannot be erased in a single moment. Still, the fact that Benjamin was alive and had the chance to rebuild his life carried meaning far greater than the pain of the lost years. On a broader level, the case significantly influenced legal and investigative systems, especially in the handling of missing children. It demonstrated the necessity of maintaining complete records, sustaining federal-state information connections, and periodically re-examining old cases as technology advances. Solving the case through DNA reinforced the view that files must be preserved long-term, and that every piece of data, however small, can become a critical puzzle piece. At the same time, the case laid the groundwork for more modern alert, search, and investigative procedures, making the system far more effective in subsequent decades. The lasting significance of the Benjamin Hall case extends beyond a single criminal investigation. It has become a symbol of perseverance, faith in justice, and the power that science brings to uncovering truth, no matter how many years it has been hidden. The case proves that time is not always the destroyer of investigative efforts. Sometimes time, combined with technological progress and human persistence, is the very factor that allows scattered pieces to finally fall into place. In today's United States, Benjamin Hall's story is not just a cold case solved after 16 years. It is a very specific reminder of how we protect children, how we trust the system, yet never surrender completely to it. Benjamin was abducted in broad daylight in a safe San Jose neighborhood in 1968 by someone familiar, neighbor Henry Dalton, the man who chatted, fixed things, and acted friendly with the kid. This is a very common American pattern. The predator is not always a stranger in the shadows, but often an adult the community automatically assumes is fine. The practical lesson is that parents today must still teach children safety boundaries, even with the nice neighbor, and adults in the community must stay alert to grooming signs. Adults who prefer one-on-one time with kids, isolate them from the group, control information, just as Dalton isolated Benjamin and spun the story that your parents are in trouble. The police can't be trusted. Sophie Miller's detail, the little neighbor girl, who saw Benjamin standing next to Dalton in the green Nova, shows how vital child witnesses can be. Today, when a child says, "I saw something weird in a parking lot at school or at church," adults should treat it as serious data, not just kid talk. On the other hand, the fact that DNA and national databases confirmed Ben Turner was Benjamin Hall reminds us that every document, photo, medical record, school enrollment, has long-term value. Therefore, every family should keep basic records and up-to-date photos of their children and be ready to cooperate with organizations like NCMEC if something happens. Finally, Benjamin's reintegration journey offers today's Americans a very contemporary lesson. When a victim returns, what they need is not just the joy of reunion, but space to heal, respect for boundaries, and long-term psychological support, rather than pressure to go back to normal, as if 16 missing years never happened. Thank you for following the emotional case-breaking journey of Benjamin Hall. If this story touched you, please subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future cases revealed through persistence and scientific progress. See you in the next video, where we'll continue exploring real stories that remind us to cherish safety, family, and justice.